Well, Julie, good morning to you.
Hello, Ed, and good evening to you.
And it's been a while since we've had a conversation, and I'm very happy to have an opportunity to talk with you this morning.
Likewise, very much so. Mm.
And so I've had a lot of requests wondering if we haven't fallen off the edge of the cliff because we haven't had any videos up, and people have actually really not only enjoyed them, but have benefited very, very much from, primarily your time with Adida and your understanding of Adida. So I just wanted to remind you again how much people value our conversations and primarily your connection with Adida, which comes through, and that's very important.
Wonderful. Well, I'm equally as grateful for the opportunity. Yes, very much so. And also, there's nothing that gives me greater pleasure than being able to speak about the gifts and the time with him, and then also what he has awakened and what he gives, and to serve in any way that I can that can be helpful for people to feel him in every way.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wanted to start with something that we have touched on privately in our conversations that has been a consistent interest for both of us, and also a conundrum for many people. And I want to go to what I have recently been putting on the B Zone. And I don't know how much you're aware of what I'm doing, is that I have been putting out very early dialogues, some of them published, some of them not published, and with them an audio recording. So I have collected over the years many early audio recordings. You can't even say they were published in the sense that they were just circulating through the community, like old No Remedy student courses or just tapes that were bootlegged basically in the early days in the 70s and passed around the community. And I am very, very aware of the evolution of Adida's Dharma, if you will, but also his writing and what he has developed and how it has developed in his own process. So because you were very early devotee, as early as 1976.
Well, that's when I first saw him, but 75, yes, and studied his teaching prior to that, yes.
Yeah. And so, as you well know, as many people do, is that from that early period of time, he went through a development in his own process, but he also took everybody else through the process that he was involved with, basically bringing them along. Because what I want to point to is that when I listen and read these early I think the earliest is probably June of 73, I just put up yesterday, that I can't see a difference. I mean, the tone, the voice, there really fundamentally isn't any difference from what he's saying in 1973, addressing the issues, the community himself, and up until 2008. I mean, basically, it's for me, it's as he said, I've said it a billion times, 100 million times. So I wanted to talk about the early, the later. There's an understanding today that there's a certain period of time that's the time that should be studied as his final revelatory word, which I believe is somewhere between 2004 or 5 through 2008. But I wonder if you could speak to his change or his adaptation in writing. I know the writing really took a change in 1985 with the Dawn Horse Testament, in that period of time where he used capitalizations and he stopped um, writing in the traditional manner but took on a new form of writing. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yes. A passion of mine in this observation and in a really intensive examination over all the years of his written word. One of our favorite things to do in his being with him is receiving yellow pages from him, which is where he would write on his slate that he had, and I think we've spoken about this before. Archival paper, a certain type of a pen, and we always had to have a slate around all the time, because everything that he did, as we've spoken about, was spontaneous. And whenever something was necessary to communicate, he was writing down things constantly. And with great intensity during different periods of time, as you're mentioning in the course of writing the Dawn Horse Testament. But as Adida has indicated, his writing and his communication is a literary art form. So that's very important to take into account as one aspect of his communication and his teaching work. It wasn't just meant to be a Dharma in and of itself. It is much more than that. He has described it as an agent of his divine self-revelation, which has the aspect of instruction, which addresses the lessons in relationship to the activity of the ego, that literally bars oneself from the gift of divine self-revelation, awakening in that process, which is the gift that he gives, is the process of living in the context of that awakening. And so when he would write, it was, as with everything that he did, literally was a creative process, a spontaneous creative process of coinciding with whatever he was in unqualified relationship to. That's how he lived. Everything he did was that process of unqualified relatedness, beyond the feeling of relatedness, but in perfect relationship, non-different relationship. And as he describes, he was simply communicating himself and passionately engaged in helping everyone and everything be in communion with and awaken in the context of reality. So with his writing, you would see that it was a fervor. He was so passionate about everything that he did, and his passion would come out in ways where, just an extremely detailed attention to every letter, every word, every comma, every hyphen, every parentheses, every, researching the words and the history and understanding language and working with so many people about this. And what you're pointing to it has been interesting to me, which is not different than every other aspect of his life, was that everything occurred in the context of what he describes as the sphere of the bright, so that there was no beginning and there was no end. There was always the one communication of the heart in the sphere of bright being. So things may have appeared to have changed or gone through incredible cycles of seeming like, well, wait a minute, this seems to be either a paradox or a contradiction, or what the heck? This seems so different than what you said before or did before. Well, he was always reflecting the nature of mind in relationship to everyone, and he did the same thing with his writing. So it often took many changes, seeming changes throughout time, depending upon who he was communicating to, what consideration he was involved in, what aspect of the great tradition he was addressing, or what aspect of humanity he was addressing. But the fundamental process of his twofold argument and revelation never ever changed. So what you're indicating in terms of your noticing this is that the process itself, which is an esoteric process, was never any different from the beginning to the end, so-called, of his incarnate lifetime. And everything that he manifested as treasures or forms of agency are the Leela of that process. But the fundamental yoga never changed. It could not change. Reality process cannot be changed through the language of the Dharma.
I want to bring up an item that you brought to me one time, and also other people have brought who were with him at other times close in, that much of what you find in his writings, his essays, sprung out of direct dialogues or instructions that he was giving personally with individuals. And this is not, I have been told, and people have showed to me even in the photography, even in the art, even in the scapegoat, these are direct reflections of his work with devotees.
Exactly. That's the beauty of the direct relationship to him and having lived with him. And I always want to insert this very important point, which is that even though there were certain ones that he worked with this way directly, humanly, intimately, he wanted us to know and everyone to know that he was working with everyone and everything as he did this. This is the nature of Siddha Yoga, that it has a greater impact.
When you watch as many videos as I have, it's quite clear. He expressly states many times to the devotee that he's addressing, "Don't think I'm only talking to you."
Yes.
Right.
He's speaking to patterns, repetition of mind, reverberations, energy, realms, dimensions. I mean, and he's speaking either addressing the ego act, or he is speaking to the one that is recognizing him as the beloved. So he's always only speaking to his own form. And you see him in his writing that the part that has never changed is when he is speaking of him as the guru, and also he often changed that from first person to third person. In the very early days, there was that's an aspect that is an interesting study. Why did he he never in the very early days, oftentimes, would speak directly as himself as the guru. He would speak of the guru. And then later on, as time went on and there was greater recognition, there was more of the direct expressed process of the devotional relationship and the studying of that within the great tradition. What you are pointing to, the evolution, so to speak, of his language took place because of what he was working with directly with individuals. So, for example, when I was we've shared so much material back and forth, and you have with so many people and spoken to so many people that you know full well that with every single aspect of anything that he's communicated, there's at least a person, or more often numbers of people, whom that was being delivered to, and he was speaking and addressing to them very personally. Right. Yes, and for example, in the Dawn Horse Testament, we were involved in all of the details of the process from the first stage of life until to the sixth stage of life, and even as he would describe the glimpses of the full seventh stage realization. And also, more importantly than that, was the fact that he was telling us that the entire process only occurs through the recognition response in the seventh stage awakening process. And that was what he was emphasizing most towards the end of his life, which is a way of coming full circle all the way to the very beginning, when he realized that he had this incredible communication to make about always already happy. There's no seeking, there's no method. There's, have I said it? Have I said it? There is nothing to be attained.
Well, I mean, it's very, very interesting because I'm so steeped in this. I can go back to his lessons in 1973 on the knee of listening. And I can see how he's using the word inquiry as the perfect practice.
Exactly.
You have to be in that disposition. He's always saying that if you're not in that recognition response, or however you want to term it, you're only going to see your own mind. Yep. You're only going to be working with your own self.
Yes.
And it's only through, as he says, the guru or the divine does the yoga. And he'll say in the early, he'll use the divine more than he'll use guru. Or as you say, he'll use guru in the second person or even the third person. He will never refer to himself in the first person.
And a really significant transition in that was the day of the heart, the beloved I am Da, when he spoke about his fully embodying that function of the one that is the giver of this gift, the non-difference. However, that was not new. It was just another way of making it known. And for those of us who were close to him in this very direct process with him, I have felt greatly served by being able to process this in very many different ways and different contexts, to be able to really understand the magnitude of who he was addressing and what he was addressing and how he was addressing, and how to depersonalize it, so to speak, while it was also extremely intimate. And the interesting paradox in that is that the more I understood that it wasn't about a separate me, the more intimate I have been able to be with him, but not a him that I related to as an other.
Well, see, this is as you were speaking, this is exactly I'm always seeing this as the divine emerging. It's always we're trying to see him having a process. He didn't have a process. He was gone, as the Buddha's, gone, gata. But it was only in it was the continued emergence that everybody was just witnessing. It was just this process that was going on.
Even his own person, as you indicate, it's absolutely true, and there's no way to be able to have understood that. I don't feel, because everyone would speak differently about their experience, but there is no way to justify speaking differently about the process itself that he revealed and confessed and demonstrated, because the esotericism, there are laws inherent in that, spiritual laws, transcendental laws, divine laws of the manner in which that awakening is demonstrated. And so living with him while he was involved in the seventh stage process, and as he communicated, either writing it or verbally speaking it and then having it transcribed, it was always about not the process of that which is prior to mind itself, that is free of any necessity for having to go through changes, because it's always perfect, inherently perfect and free and one and whole, yet coinciding with the continued arising of with those who presume that a difference or separation, as he was speaking to that, he was also involved in the process of transforming and emerging in the context of that, so that the conscious availability in those who have responded to him actually could stay with him. That was the art of what he was doing. He was constantly distracting us through every possible means to get our energy and attention to be participatory in this process of his emergence, as you described. It was extraordinary. And the thing that was amazing about it is that, and he's said this before, even for him, he surprised himself, or even described himself as being a bit naive about how he thought that people would get it or be ecstatic about it or would naturally fall into the process that was required to realize most fully, to self-discipline not being something that has been so profoundly difficult, or cooperation, all the different aspects that he's thinking, well, if this is really important to you, then it seemed like it would just naturally follow. So a lot of his written word then, he was an artist. As he confessed in the Knee of Listening in the very early days, the nature of the way that he would have to dance and play and be extremely vulnerably, entirely entwined with everything that he lived with in order to be able to communicate the truth of reality and the necessary insight and radical understanding, which is radical root devotion, is self-understanding, to be able to feel and receive him.
When you said the word entwined and his process, I'm thinking or feeling into his term that he was trapped in the world's mind. He was trapped. He was trapped in that. I mean, he couldn't. I mean, I remember him rattling his cane and said, implying if he was a Roshi, he would have whacked whatever across the shoulders to wake people up. Meaning that he was restricted because of the limitations of the world, really, but the people who were in his company and who he had to work with for the many, many, many years that he was. As much as he said, I'm not going to teach and I'm not going to be in this submission disposition, if you will, it's clear to me, as much as he tried, he was always brought back into that. I mean, up until the last day, he's speaking polity, he's speaking talk, he's speaking world kind of things,
Yes. So the transformation or the demonstration occurred in his process of demonstration, and yet we kept superimposing upon him the requirement for him to address the limitations, to continue to address the limitations. However, he did say that there was very, very beginning signs of this recognition, and that he had completed what he needed to give in order for the process is irrevocably established in terms of accessibility of the unique culminating revelation that is combined absolutely, entirely with the great tradition as it has appeared to our knowledge, which is very limited, in time and space, in this particular dimension within the earth realm, and in the cosmic domain. I mean, we hardly ever even fathom or even communicate with one another, taking the total picture to heart and to mind. Tend to be, because of the ego act, there is the liability to be so minusculely provincial and self-possessed and other-possessed in the orientation of what we are relating to and the choices that we make on that basis, that literally there are other dimensions, other realms, other ways of seeing and relating to reality. We're merely constricted because of this construct and the ego act itself, and seeming ourselves to be trapped. So when he's trying to communicate to us, and there is the root fear that he describes, that he has to break the spell of in order for us to be able to be the required surrender and yielding into the truth and the native condition of being, wherein the magnification and outshining of all that is not a sign and a gift and a revelation of that, if an effulgence from the divine self position is outshined. That's the process. That's the actual process. And
Right.
and yet he had to spend so much of his time addressing the demand for attention to address the problem of the ego and its seeming dilemma about everything, really. And so this is why having discussions like what we have been having for a long time now about sensitivity to him and his process and what he revealed and what he experienced, what his confession was, how he taught, how it fits into the great tradition, and the total picture of prior to mind. You know, you can't superimpose mind and understand Adi-da. It requires a surrender of the whole bodily being at heart in recognition to the native state of being that has been pointed to in the great traditions. But his teaching is about that. That's the focus of his teaching, you know, the fundamental revelation of the self position that you cannot wrap your mind around. The whole body has to be surrendered into it. And his writing, like I was remembering a time when he was writing the Dawn-Horse Testament, and of course there were times when it changed too. He always made changes, and then there was other editions of different things that he wrote. And to note, importantly, is that the writing that is what is in the Aletheon or the Pneumaton or the Gnosticon, the Scapegoat, all the different not to his piece, all of that literature is a lot of material that was from the past that he had worked on and brought into through as a literary art form and a form of agency and a gift to everyone that actually demonstrates the process of his Leela. So the study of it from very early on is very important to actually understand the nuances of all the changes. Because it's not like he sat down one day abstractly and wrote something new. It was as again, as you indicated, it was always done in direct relationship to reality itself, in relationship to those that he was either addressing as egoic or the beloved that was recognizing him as non-different other. So there was always those dialogues and that relationship going on with everyone and everything, literally, whether they were physically in his company or not.
As you're speaking, I'm thinking, yes, I agree, totally, and I can take 1986, for example, a 1986 article called Sadhana Hurts, and I can take that and I can find an essay in the Aletheon. That's exactly that essay, or that talk, really. And I can just see, and I can take that article that was written out of the talk in 86 and see what he did with it in 2007 or 8 when he wrote the Aletheon, and see what the changes were. And I've done that with the 85 Dawn-Horse Testament, the 91 to 204. I mean, I've done it with all of them. But I want to get to the intensity by which he was addressing the imminence and the importance of the moment, of what you might call the late time, right? So I'm finding in other writings, whether it be the latest book by Peter Kingsley called The Book of Life, and I'll use him as an example, and if people don't know Peter Kingsley, they should know Peter Kingsley. Or it would be good to know Peter Kingsley. But it seems like the moment, in not just the moment for me or you, but the moment of the world is in such an intense time. Everything is heightened. Everything is potentially explosive. Everything is speeding to such an intensity that, and it's as if everybody's looking for something at a speed at which it's getting dangerous not only to the individual but to many others and also to the world, because they're running out of time, they're running out of space, they're running out of resources. You know, it's really a very intense time. And I'm thinking of, you know, his emphasis on the source text. And I'm thinking about, don't waste. You do have to. Here's the thing for me and for many other people. When I put out the early literature, they say, yes, I can understand it, and this is what brought me here, and this is when it was in the golden age, and that's my term, but you know, when everybody could understand it and it was really good and they could benefit from it. And as that teaching and as the writing changed, it really got intensified. And if you read the post-85 period of time, there's no discussion here. There's just one thing happening. And you know, and he's always bringing you, and his capitalizations and his parentheses are always taking the mind and bringing it back. You know, there's no way to let's talk about this, and let's talk about psychology, and let's talk about, although you have to handle it. Here's the paradox of that I feel is that the moment today in 2021 is not the same moment as it was in 1973, meaning that we're, you know, you can take what was there and use it and think about it and see the similarity, but the moment we're in today is such an intense moment.
Yes, yes. The first thing is his confession is guru as prophet, and that my feeling is that living with him, and even now I still feel the him, the siddhis. Him to me are his siddhis, which are the unique forms of feeling the qualities of the divine being, presence, process, and those are his person to me, very much alive, even though he's no longer physically present, absolutely tacitly tangible. And I would say if there's one word that described him all the time was urgent. Always an urgency. And that's what I feel oftentimes made it somewhat difficult for a lot of people to remain close to him and to be around him, because of the intensity of his urgency to communicate what was pouring out of his being with such intense fervor and love and fierceness and directness. Like this was no game, like game over, but yes, we can play. But this play is serious. This is a very, very serious matter, not because of us having to feel guilty or feel wrong or feel bad, but because this purpose is about saving humanity from destroying itself. And this is very important because this is a necessary place, and as he said, this is a good place for love. This domain is the place in which, however one manifests in whatever dimension, the truth itself and reality itself must and always coincide with the heart. And the heart, as this native feeling of being, is love, bliss. And look at what we are doing with one another. Look at what humanity has done with one another throughout all seeming time and space and history. So prior to his embodiment, of course, there was the great tradition and of religious and spiritual and social and political humanity and the development of its relationship to all of the resources and earth and wanting to know it and own it and control it. Did any of that actually produce a better world? Look
Well, you might have more electricity, you have more running water, you have flush toilets and sanitation.
Yes, well, this is true. There are aspects of what humanity has done that seems to be an advancement that could have positive virtues. However, there is the dark side. There is the nature of the full spectrum that we have to be aware of. And what tends to be manifesting more prominently is the lowest common denominator of the ones who are satisfied with something less than being awake and actually mature and assuming responsibility, going beyond the addictions that are demonstrated because of a frustration or an inability to be actually do what's required to grow up and to actually awaken to the truth of the condition within which we are living, even though there have been numerous saints, sages, realizers, humanitarians, intelligent people who have done amazing things. Humanity has not made right use of any of it, even with the arts. That's true. Everything tends to be reflecting the dark side of what we tend to do with one another rather than living in relationship to one another that is bringing about a transformation of humanity whereby we could live entirely differently if we actually chose to do it. And that's not the choice of what's happening today. So that was what he constantly reflected to us all the time, was that your choices are not reflecting this recognition of truth, of reality, of freedom, of happiness, of love.
Well, this is where he was always emphasizing the ancient way that we have lost what the true nature of humanity is about. And, you can take it through whatever the scientific revolution or the Renaissance or whatever, but, where ego or science or math or control over nature started to become, it was beneficial to discover, find out about electricity or whatever. But with the sense, with not understanding the gift of that through in the disposition that the divine was the one who is always the maker of everything, if you will. If you just took, and this is the switch, is that if I discovered electricity, instead of the gift was given to me to use this in a way that would benefit the nature and the planet, and understanding the unity of one's being with the totality of oneself. But again, this is not a utopia. We're not speaking about a new utopia, but we're also not speaking about killing the planet and leaving it for our grandchildren to suffer.
Right. No, we're talking about a right relationship.
Right.
Making right use of it for true heart, divine purposes of compassion and love and growth and outgrowing and transcending and accepting the fullness of what is native to being alive, which is birth, living, and dying. Speaking of the ancient tradition, something you sent me recently where, speaking about Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and there's the different aspects of manifest existence that requires everyone to live in right feeling discrimination to the fact that we observe constantly every day, it's in our face. There is birth, there is sustenance, and there is death. And we always want to focus on the birth and the sustenance and being sustained and kept alive, and but the death part, we don't want to look at that side, you see, and the actual refusal to do that is actually what's manifesting the necessity for us to have to, because whatever you avoid or whatever you don't handle, whatever you don't relate to rightly, it's going to come right back at you, because you're going to have to wake up and assume responsibility for the nature of your own being in relationship to what arises.
Here's the subtle aspect of that, the esoteric part of it, is the death is in the illusion of the person. The death is in the illusion of oneself. This is where it gets a bit complicated, because here, we're thinking about, oh, I'm alive and I've got to die, or I've got to be transcended into some other manifestation. But the whole point of what he's addressing, and the ancient ones have addressed, is that this whole phenomenon has got a premise that isn't correct. It's not
right.
It's not
right.
It's not founded in the law. It's not founded in truth. It's not founded in reality.
Yes. And this reminds me of another conversation that we've been having a lot that's along the same lines, which is that in relationship to the Dharma, and Dharma as it has been given throughout all the traditions, is that this may not be real, quote unquote, or it could be considered an illusion. It's always temporary, passing. It will, arise and fall. However, all the different traditions may want to relate to it. But it is real in the sense that you cannot violate the sacred nature and the vulnerability of being manifest here and claim that you have realized something great. So you can't, like being casually dismissive or aggressively indifferent, in a way that it doesn't really matter because it's not real. So I'm just going to sit back in my cubby here in my meditative cave, and I'm just going to go into another dimension, and I don't really care what happens to everyone and everything. That's not what Adida is about, you see. And he's also not about worshiping an other or being devoted to an other in a fashion that is deluding or is negating the fact that your own fundamental condition is something that you have to awaken into and be responsible for. So at the end of his life, one of the things that he was emphasizing in his writing, in the Aletheon, the Pneumaton, and the Gnosticon, which completely covers the entire great tradition of humanity in every aspect, and then the Dawn Horse Testament in more fundamental detail relative to the actual process and practice if you choose to respond as a devotee of a Siddha Guru, of him as Satguru Siddha Da. If you choose that, then there's an incredibly detailed process to enter into, but the appreciation of his radical understanding and insight of the great tradition, it's pointing to the fact that you can't, if you recognize reality, you are absolutely more vulnerably in love and passionately sensitive to the fragility of it. And that's what he demonstrated in our living with him. And that's how you saw his human nature. He wasn't hiding anything. He was like passionately there with all of his fervor from every gesture that he made was a penetrating force, whether it was gentle or it was loud. It was a force of undoing the abstraction or dissociation from the non-different position within which we arise. And so he, at the end of his life, kept saying, I am not other. I am the divine self condition that is your condition, no difference, no difference. And so I have recently been listening more and more to a lot of the very respected and loud voices today on the world stage that are influencing the psyche and the mind of humanity in response to these dark times. And I've noticed something interesting is that they all have this kind of fervor and concern about what is happening, but everyone will be relating to it from a different point of view. And oddly enough, a lot of them have a very direct understanding and knowledge of Adida, but Adida is not often brought onto the world stage. And it's because of the, I think, the fierce, penetrating criticism that is given by him to how humanity has tended to use the mind or the body or impulse or intention to try to solve the world as a problem that's coming from a point of view that represents an illusion about the nature of self in relationship to what is arising. And that must be surrendered in order to be able to actually be in a situation in which we can collectively do something different altogether to change this, because it's not going to be by all of the methodology or the formulating or characterizing or classifying or recommending techniques to change things. It's not going to make a difference. It's going to be, as he describes in Not To Is Peace, it's going to have to do with human beings at a very human level, changing something about the circumstance of how we relate to the divine reality. And that was what it was like for him at the end of his life. After everything was said and done, what was he passionate about? You're not relating humanly to one another and to me rightly, so that the divine transcendental spiritual work can actually unfold.
Well, this is the missing key that a lot of people tend to bypass. Is that there's a certain sense of what you might call lacking self-understanding. I mean, it's good to recognize the turmoil, the difficulties, the insanity, the madness, the dire condition of where we live today and how we live. But if there isn't the right asana, in that you can't do it from this place. You can't do it with even though you are on the side of goodness, on the side of the righteous, or whatever.
Yeah, no matter how virtuous. These are what, when we often refer to the word laws, that's a strong word to use, but you could call it keys. You could call the laws and the keys. Well, there are locks, and anyone who's done yoga of any form, seriously, that is about conducting the force of life and energy, whether it even be within the body, mind, or in relationship to the greater sphere, healers, shamans, psychics, people who have great capability of being able to connect with and are very empathetic or sympathetically related to this time. When there are places that are constricted, if that can't be unlocked, there's no flow. There's no liberating freedom. And it is exactly the same with the process in the bright, is that the entire body-mind has to be undone.
Meaning open to that transmission, open to the force, open to the transmission.
Yeah, yes. And it's not a killing of anything, because what you're presuming is dying. The ego death is not the killing of something that is concrete in and of itself. So this surrender is not a negative process at all of annihilation. It's actually a liberation of awakening to that which is prior and true, replacing falsehood with truthhood, and the passionate ability to live in that and be that. That's the process.
And this is really the key in much of what I understand that his shout, if you will, is about, is that the fear, which is the motivating factor for saving something or to helping something, or the fear that's permeating the world today in the survival sense of not only the world survival, but your own survival. This is the real kind of conundrum we're working and speaking about, is because this is exactly the fear is what has to be fear is ego. It's not like it's happening or whatever. This is what is
Yes.
manifesting.
Yes.
All of
Yes.
this. It's just
Yes.
on this.
Yes. And for good reason. I mean, if you're doing this and you feel confined just to this in relationship to everything that seems other, and it's terrifying. Yes, it makes sense.
Yeah.
But the divine message is that is your activity. This is not the truth. This is therefore an illusion, meaning it's not like vaporous, like it's not real.
Right.
You know, this is real shit that we have to deal with. You know, this is very, very, each person is to be loved and respected and related to rightly, everything. This is a sacred event. It's not a profane event. It's not something to be discarded and ignored and treated casually at all. At all. And Adida never did that. Never did that. There was never a casual movement from him ever in relationship to anyone or anything. Oftentimes we might not be able to explain the why of it, why he chose to do what he did at certain times, and a lot of it was surprising, even shocking or inexplicable or paradoxical. But you see, he has a function, as have many have functions, from very, very simple ones to, you know, taking care of a baby to liberating mankind, you know, and having used both of those examples, they're not too different in the sense of the sensitivity of the cultivating and the nurturing of that which must come awake and alive in right relationship. It's being here in this time and space and place. And so one of the things I have noticed also in studying a bit more and listening more to the voices that are speaking and being listened to by millions, if not thousands and thousands of people daily, are gravitating towards certain voices. And as I've mentioned, many of these voices, oftentimes I know that they know of Adida, but they won't speak of Adida for different reasons, which is I want to investigate more. Because it's interesting, you see, and these individuals are not to be shunned or discarded or disrespected. I find it really interesting. And but the one criticism that is given is that oftentimes what he communicates and confesses is being superimposed upon him that reflects the limited point of view of the viewer, or the one that is giving the criticism. They're not actually hearing the profundity of his esoteric confession of non-difference. They're objectifying what is being confessed as an ecstatic speech of that which is the case of everyone and everything, all inclusively. And,
well, I personally would love to have that discussion, because people have asked me to have that discussion with you, because there is a lot of, this might just be polite and say, controversy that still lingers on about many things that, as you mentioned, that Adida's wisdom has permeated many, many thousands and thousands
many more than we know. Many more than we know.
And they will use the wisdom of Adida, but without mentioning the source of where they got it.
Right.
And as he often humorously said, you want the soup without the cook, you know.
And that's not an uncommon thing to do. You know, like just as, you know, in the arts or like in cooking or any form of, you know, being creative, you know, you see something, oh, I'm inspired by that. Oh, yeah, I can put it in my own words or whatever. And that's fair enough. And I think that there's actually been an overreaction on the part of the gathering of devotees in relationship to people who have found useful aspects of Beloved's teaching and integrated it into their own system. It's like, you know, that's fair enough. But then my question is, do you want to actually really understand? You know, why would you want to continue to be at odds when many of these people actually also will, in this next breath, acknowledge the absolute profundity and genius.
I think they want to fix the problem first, and then they'll work with whatever they got to work with. But right now, there's something more important, and I want to do what's more important. And we'll get to that later. But right now,
yeah. You know, and we know what that's like, right? I understand that logic because. You know, and what it's really doing is avoiding relationship to that which is requiring your surrender into the position within which you would even be able to exercise the real discrimination to relate to the parent problem.
I got to get this done. We'll come back to that, but right now I got to do that.
Oh, yeah. That's the automaticity. That's the automaticity.
So I'm looking at the time. So I want to go back to where we started, in the sense of the evolution, if you will, or the change, or the emergence, however we want to address the change or the way in which he was writing, as he was addressing, and many people say that really the only thing that you should be studying now, if you're serious. Now, many people will be still very wanting to read and study the older materials, but I believe there's a consensus by some to only be focused on the revelatory, or the final word, and there's a certain kind of understanding today that there's just certain amount of time left or whatever, and you've got to just focus in on this one summary or the completion of his word, shall we say?
Right. Well, that could be a whole conversation just in and of itself. But there's just a few points that come to my feeling in relationship to that, and that is that there's a fanaticism around that right now, and there are reasons for why, which are not entirely rightly aligned to understanding everything that he said about what should be done to communicate about him. For example, the Leela. When you tell his Leela, you inevitably are referring to the apparent past that is in relationship to his communication, his Dharma, his play, the way that he taught. It inevitably includes communicating or addressing something that he said or did, and a dialogue that was had. So it's not about cutting off anything whatsoever. It's entirely not true that you should not relate to anything prior to what he did in the last few years of his life. That's not true. That's not true. And the other part of it is that the necessity to understand why he said that this culminating, the way in which he's communicating it in the literature that he communicated at the end of his life, there tends to be a focus on the aletheon. But there's not to his peace, there's the Scapegoat book, and there is the Dawn-Horse Testament, none of which have been focused on.
Oh, and well, they actually haven't been published.
Yes. Yeah. So that the totality of all of what he pointed to as the source texts are not just that which speaks about the perfect practice and radical root yoga and right life. I mean, you can say all three of those terms, but as we were speaking about, the perfect practice and the communication of perfect knowledge, he spoke about all the thread all throughout. So to actually understand it is a leela and participation in a process that is alive and present, eternal time, that is inclusive of all time and space and everyone and everything. The exact same thing is also true with right life in terms of the embrace of the details and the process and the practice. How do you actually do that? The Dawn-Horse Testament isn't even published. there isn't even a culture that actually exists that's qualified for evaluation of the process yet. It's still in its beginning stages of even understanding and comprehending the Leela of what occurred. And those of us who were the soldiers or the warriors or the old timers or the participants, the process that we're all going through is immense in our own lives and in relationship to one another and the world. You know, to integrate the reality that, oh, yes, I can see. Oh, my gosh, this person, beloved, was Adida was working with these individuals just as much as with me, this seeming me. I mean, literally grokking that, you know, undoes the cultic insiderism around his life and how, I mean, that was what he was trying to break free of, was this cultic enclosure. And he kept saying, I am here for everyone and everything, the entire great tradition, you know, the divine reality of all those who genuinely brought the divine heart into this sphere and this domain. And then you have the perfect knowledge, the right life, and the radical root devotion is radical self-understanding. It's recognition, and you cannot recognize without understanding the ego act in all of its detailed nuances. So it's not any different. The end communication, the end time is no different than what he said the first time he sat down in Melrose or whatever he was speaking about up on the hill, you know, above the ashram, and even earlier than that, and his whole process. Look at the knee of listening. It's exactly the same revelation of what we have to engage and demonstrate. So it's incredible study, his life, his Leela. And just before we end, I want to say one thing and tell you a moment in time that was remarkable to point to this, to how I feel that the unfolding of every aspect of what he's done, which is a creative process, you know, constantly creative, and an artful priesthood, mastery, intimately felt, is that one day on the island, I was called to receive some yellow pages from him. And this was his writing and working on a manuscript and such. And it was what's called the Matrix, and it's on the house that sits on the ocean. And he had a desk that was right close to the ocean, so you could hear the water lapping up on the shore. And, you know, it was just very much integrated with all of the elements on the island. And I sat down at his feet, and he said to me that he wanted to give us a mantra. And this was the first time that he had ever, apart from giving us early the name Da, you know, when he whispered the name Da, call upon me by the name Da. And so that was instilled, Da, at the heart, Da, the descent and the invocation of the giver. And he sat me down and he had me put on the tape recorder, and he gave the mantra Om Ma Da. And so he said it and wanted it recorded. And I still feel the reverberation of that in my being. And he, Om Ma Da, Om Ma Da, Om Ma Da, Om Ma Da. And with his voice and just came fully down into my body and being and through down into the floor, into the earth, you know, and all around I could feel the reverberation of this initiation of the Om Ma Da. And then he proceeded to describe to me exactly what the Om, the Ma, and the Da. And of course, in the recording of this and in the writing of this, all of this then becomes material for which he would then put into his literature. So there's the writing of it and the communicating of it, but at the essence of it was the initiatory force of the transmission that occurred in that moment. That recording exists.
Yes,
you know, and if you go on YouTube, and if you go on YouTube, you'll hear it. Om Ma Da, Om Ma Da, and feeling the force of it, no matter how it sounds, you receive that. That's the relationship, the reception of that transmission. And as he said, everything else on top of that is an artful communication of it that transmits, or to, you know, is the sign, the threshold forms of that passageway into the divine bright domain that then becomes the spherical context within which we recognize everyone and everything is non-different. Yeah. Mm.
Well, I think this is a perfect ending to our discussion. And I want to thank you.
Yeah, thank you,
Ed. And I want to thank our listeners and watchers for staying with us during this discussion. And I want to promise our listeners and watchers that we will be continuing our dialogue in a more frequent manner in the future. So again.
Yeah, thank you so much.